I wanted to ask you a few questions about why did you decide to write about that subject?
The emergency meeting was already prepared. Chairs had been placed, advisors summoned, and William was moments away from entering a discussion that could reshape how Diana's private archive was handled. Then he saw one name on the attendance sheet: Camilla's solicitor. According to the fictional scenario at the heart of this drama, the prince stopped, stared at the page, and made a decision nobody in the corridor expected. The meeting was cancelled immediately. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William did not raise his voice. He did not need to. A palace aide handed him the final attendance sheet before the meeting began, and the future king read until one entry stopped him cold. He circled the solicitor's name with his finger, placed the page on the table, and said the discussion would not proceed. Diana's private archive meant the collection of her personal letters, notes, records, and preserved material kept for historical and family purposes. To him, that was not paperwork. It was part of his mother's voice, and the idea that Camilla's legal representative had been cleared to enter that conversation felt deeply personal. Camilla received the news within minutes. She sat silent as an aide explained that the gathering had been halted before anyone entered, and she understood why her name was tied to the cancellation, though she had not been present. The queen consort knew the emotional danger. Any suggestion that her legal interests had crossed into Diana's legacy could reopen wounds the family had tried to contain. Yet the humiliation cut both ways. She could feel herself becoming the symbol of an intrusion before anyone had explained who approved the solicitor's attendance. The silence around that approval made everything worse. William demanded to know who had authorized the name, whether the solicitor had previously asked for consultation rights, and whether anyone had been given advance knowledge of the archive material. His questions sharpened because nobody offered an immediate answer. One senior aide admitted that the entry had passed through palace coordination, meaning somebody had deliberately decided Camilla required legal representation inside a discussion involving Diana. That detail changed the mood completely. The prince was no longer looking at a clerical mistake. He was looking at a decision. Then another memory surfaced. One aide remembered an earlier moment when Camilla's legal circle had been mentioned around Diana-related papers, and William's expression hardened the instant he heard it. The cancellation shocked the room, but the real danger lay in the history behind that single name, because William had seen it connected to Diana's legacy before. Here is Section 2 as a continuous 440-word script with no subscription line. To outsiders, it could look like a dispute over procedure. To William, it is nothing of the sort. Diana's archive represents memory, grief, reputation, and the fragments of a mother whose story has been fought over for decades. Camilla, meanwhile, faces a different fear, that merely being connected to the meeting has transformed her into the symbol of an intrusion she insists she never intended to make. William remained alone after the cancellation, the attendance sheet still in his hands. He read the names again, slower this time, until his eyes returned to Diana's name printed across the meeting agenda. The anger that had carried him through the corridor began to shift into something heavier. For the prince, those letters, private notes, preserved records, and legacy materials were not simply palace property. They were family history first, fragments of a mother whose voice had been interpreted by strangers for years. That was why the solicitor's presence struck so deeply. He feared remembrance itself was being turned into negotiation. Camilla felt the pressure from a completely different direction. She told Charles privately that she had never asked for a confrontation with William and never wanted her legal interests placed beside Diana's memory. The queen consort understood exactly why the association was dangerous. Any suggestion that she was attempting to influence material connected to the late princess could reopen one of the monarchy's oldest emotional wounds. Yet when the king asked whether she had known her solicitor might attend, she hesitated, only for a moment. But that moment changed everything. He noticed it, and she knew he had noticed. Charles did not accuse her. His silence carried more weight than accusation. The monarch now understood that the cancelled meeting was becoming secondary. The real problem was whether his wife had known legal preparations were being made before William had been properly informed. If she had, then the future king would see the attendance list not as a mistake, but as proof that decisions involving his mother were being shaped around him. That possibility frightened Charles, because it threatened trust between father and son as much as it threatened peace inside his marriage. Catherine found William before that suspicion could harden into certainty. She urged him to separate what he knew from what he feared, reminding him that grief could sharpen instinct, but could also fill silence with conclusions. He listened, because she understood the emotional cost without dismissing it. Still, the unease remained. Then an older episode returned to the conversation. A memorial review, one archived letter, and a legal request that should never have reached Camilla's advisors. William's anger was rooted in grief, but grief alone had not caused the cancellation. The true trigger had been planted months earlier. Months before the cancelled meeting, there had been another gathering, smaller, quieter, almost forgotten. It concerned a proposed commemorative exhibition using selected personal material connected to Diana. That meeting ended without drama. But 3 days later, a legal query arrived, asking whether one particular archived letter could create reputational complications for another senior royal. William would eventually discover who had been copied into that request. From that moment forward, he stopped treating archive access as routine. William had supported the earlier review because, at first, it seemed respectful. The Diana Memorial Exhibition Review was simply a private process for deciding which letters, notes, and personal records might be suitable for a future commemorative display. Archivists were expected to guide it, not lawyers. To the prince, that mattered, because historical judgment felt different from legal defense. One preserved letter could carry grief, context, and memory all at once. He believed those things deserved care before anyone started asking what damage they might cause. 3 days later, the atmosphere changed. An archivist received a formal legal query asking whether one specific Diana letter contained material that could affect Camilla's position or public reputation. The request did not ask what the letter meant historically. It asked what it might mean for someone still living. That distinction hit William hard. During a private briefing, he read the line about reputational implications, looked up sharply, and asked, "Why is her lawyer involved?" He did not need a long answer. The question itself exposed how deeply the matter had shifted. Charles felt the pressure immediately. He wanted to protect Camilla from assumptions, but he also understood why his son saw the query as something more serious than caution. The king knew Diana's private words were already emotionally charged, and allowing them to be filtered through another royal's legal interests risked turning memory into liability. He urged William not to accuse before the facts were clear, yet he could not dismiss the pain behind the suspicion. Then the archivist revealed the detail that changed everything. In a documented internal account, he confirmed the query had not originated with the archive team at all. It had arrived through a palace intermediary whose identity was not disclosed in the briefing. William responded by ordering that no further Diana-related material be discussed with outside representatives without direct authorization. Months later, when Camilla's solicitor appeared on the emergency meeting list anyway, the prince did not see a clerical error. He saw a warning ignored. For him, the pattern was no longer accidental. It was to feel deliberate, coordinated, and personal. That earlier warning transformed the new invitation from an administrative surprise into something William considered a direct challenge. The confrontation does not explode in public. It happens behind a closed door, which makes every word heavier. William enters first. Camilla is already there. Charles remains nearby, but says nothing, as the prince places the cancelled attendance sheet between them. He does not raise his voice. He does not need to. His question is narrow, personal, and devastating. Why was her solicitor preparing to enter a meeting about his mother? William had asked for this conversation before advisors could bury the cancellation beneath procedure. He wanted no softened explanation, no carefully prepared palace language, and no attempt to reduce the crisis to scheduling. The prince believed the issue was simple. someone had approved legal representation inside a discussion involving Diana's private archive. Camilla watched him closely, while Charles stood between two loyalties he could no longer separate. The household's legal coordination process, the internal system used to manage sensitive legal matters across royal offices, had now become part of a deeply personal family conflict. The silence tightened when William slid the attendance sheet toward Camilla and tapped the solicitor's name. She did not touch the page. He told her that his mother's archive could not become a place where living royals arrived, protected against whatever Diana might have written. To him, that changed the purpose of the entire process. The archive was supposed to preserve truth and memory, not calculate who might be embarrassed by either one. His restraint made the accusation cut deeper, because every word sounded chosen, controlled, and final. Camilla finally pushed back. She insisted that the solicitor was never meant to alter, suppress, or influence Diana's record. The Queen Consort said legal advice had been discussed only to protect procedural fairness if sensitive material affected living members of the family. She was visibly wounded by the assumption that her motives must automatically be hostile. Then William asked whether she had known about those discussions before the meeting. She hesitated, then admitted that she had. She stressed that she had never personally demanded the invitation, but the admission changed the temperature instantly. Charles could no longer stay silent. When William asked who had authorized the solicitor's presence, the king intervened and said the decision had moved through the household's legal coordination process rather than coming directly from Camilla. He refused to name a single official in that moment. The answer did not calm his son. It redirected him. The prince now understood that the conflict was bigger than one person sitting across from him. The argument appeared personal, yet the deeper William looked, the clearer it became that somebody inside the royal machinery had made the decision possible. Canceling a meeting is easy. Discovering who had the authority to shape it is harder. William now turns away from the emotional confrontation and toward the paper trail. The list had been approved. Security clearance had been considered. Attendance had been circulated. Someone had treated Camilla's solicitor not as an outsider, but as a legitimate participant. And when the prince begins asking who signed off on that assumption, the palace suddenly becomes far less talkative. William starts pressing for answers with a calm that makes the tension worse. The archive meeting had required several layers of approval because Diana-related material could touch family history, privacy, and the monarchy's public reputation all at once. Household officials, archivists, legal officers, and the sovereign's office each held part of the process. The sovereign's office simply meant the team working directly under the king on matters requiring his authority. William may have carried the strongest personal connection to his mother, but he did not control every administrative door around her records. Charles receives the briefing late in the day. It names the senior official who approved legal attendance and explains the reasoning behind it. The king reads the page once, then again. He removes his glasses and sets the file down without speaking. He now understands that defending Camilla personally will not solve what has happened. A system operating under his own authority allowed something William had already warned against. That realization leaves him trapped between loyalty to his wife and responsibility for the machinery surrounding the crown. Camilla feels that machinery turning against her. What began as legal representation is now being interpreted as proof that her interests and Diana's legacy cannot exist inside the same discussion. The Queen Consort knows how brutal that symbolism is. She had hoped the solicitor's presence would reduce risk. Instead, it has made her look like the risk itself. Her isolation deepens because nobody can reassure her without sounding as though they are defending the very arrangement that caused the crisis. Then William reaches the line that changes his anger into resolve. The attendance approval had been justified because the meeting might involve material with reputational implications for living members of the family. To the prince, those words are explosive. They mean Diana's archive had already been judged partly by what her private words might do to people still alive. That is the boundary he refuses to accept. William answers with a new condition. Future Diana archive meetings will exclude personal legal representatives for living royals. Once he understood the language being used behind closed doors, He stopped arguing about one solicitor and began rewriting the boundaries themselves. The first consequence arrives quietly. No announcement, no dramatic decree, just a revised meeting protocol circulated to a tiny group of people. Diana-related archival discussions will proceed without representatives whose role is to protect the personal interests of living royals. For William, it is a safeguard. For Camilla, the meaning is unmistakable. The very legal protection intended to defend her has instead become the reason she is pushed further away. William authorizes a smaller archive review process built around historians, custodians, and family representatives rather than personal solicitors. The prince wants every future discussion to begin with preservation, context, and historical responsibility. An archive review process is simply the controlled system used to decide how sensitive records are studied, protected, and handled. Legal concerns can still be raised, but only separately in writing. Nobody will be allowed to sit inside the discussion and argue a living royal's interests against Diana's private words. For him, the boundary feels overdue. For Camilla, it feels painfully specific. Camilla reads the revised protocol alone. She reaches the clause excluding personal legal representatives, pauses, then places the pages down. The queen consort understands immediately that her name does not need to appear anywhere. Staff will know why the restriction exists. That is what makes the humiliation sharper. Publicly, nothing has happened to her. Privately, a new rule now stands as a permanent reminder that her solicitor's presence triggered William's refusal to proceed. She had once believed legal caution could protect her. Now the same caution has made her look incompatible with Diana's legacy. Charles sees the damage but refuses to reverse the safeguard. The king knows his wife feels isolated, yet he also knows that challenging William now would send an even harsher message, that Camilla's comfort matters more than his son's trust. Catherine soon learns that the prince is prepared to withdraw from the archive process entirely if the boundaries are challenged again. She understands the seriousness of that threat. William is no longer bargaining over procedure. He is drawing a line around the one part of royal history he refuses to watch become a legal contest. Camilla briefly considers issuing a written explanation, stating that she never sought control over Diana's papers. Then she stops. The monarch's wife realizes that defending herself could revive the very controversy she once buried. Charles reaches the same conclusion from another direction. Lawyers, protocols, and intermediaries have taken the family as far as they can. He asks William for a private conversation, with no aides and no papers between them. The machinery had produced a solution, but not peace. Peace would require a father and son to speak, without the palace protecting either of them. There are no lawyers in the room, no private secretaries, no archive folders. Charles and William sit opposite one another with nothing to hide behind except years of shared history. The king knows this conversation is no longer about attendance lists. His son knows it too. At its heart is an older question: whether Diana's memory will always become collateral whenever the present royal family tries to protect itself. This time, Charles decides not to argue with the pain. Charles had asked for the meeting because every previous discussion had become tangled in protocol, legal language, and competing loyalties. He wanted no intermediary, shaping his words before they reached William. The prince arrived expecting resistance, convinced his father might ask him to soften the new restrictions to spare Camilla further embarrassment. A firewall, in this context, simply meant a firm separation between personal legal interests and the historical review of Diana's records. William had created that boundary because he no longer trusted informal assurances. Charles did not ask him to remove it. Instead, he said the solicitor should never have been included without William's knowledge. The admission landed harder than an argument would have. The prince remained silent for several seconds, but some of the tension in his posture eased. His father was not defending the decision. He was acknowledging the breach. Then the king went further. He told his son that protecting his marriage could not require him to feel that Diana's memory was negotiable, or that her words had to be measured first against the comfort of people still living. William finally answered with the truth he had been holding beneath the anger. He said the cancellation had been driven by fear as much as fury. Once lawyers entered the archive process, he feared his mother's private voice would stop being treated as history and start being filtered through competing interests. The future king did not want every difficult sentence softened, interpreted, or delayed because somebody might feel threatened by it. Charles listened without interrupting. For once, the pain was allowed to exist without being corrected. Charles agreed that the firewall would remain. William, in return, accepted that Camilla could not be personally blamed for every procedural failure surrounding the archive. The prince would hold the system accountable without turning every mistake into a judgment against her. It was not forgiveness, because neither man framed it that way. It was something quieter, an agreement about where the line belonged. Then the outside world caught up. By the following morning, word of the cancelled meeting and the Diana dispute had escaped palace walls. Father and son had finally reached an understanding. Yet outside those walls, the story was only beginning to acquire a meaning of its own. By morning, the cancelled meeting is no longer a palace secret. Diana's name is back where the monarchy has always feared and depended upon it being, at the emotional center of the public conversation. But this time, the argument is not about old photographs or anniversaries. It is about who gets to stand near her private history, and whether William's refusal to let a solicitor into that space represents grief, power, or protection. William sees the first front page over breakfast and says nothing. A fictional London newspaper has splashed the headline, "William walks out for Diana," above an image from an earlier memorial engagement. The prince studies it, then turns the paper face down before speaking to Catherine. She knows the danger immediately. Public sympathy can feel like support, but it can also turn a private boundary into a national battle. Archive governance simply means the rules deciding who can access, review, and manage historical records. Now those rules are being debated far beyond the palace. Outside Kensington Palace, the mood grows more intense. A small crowd gathers near the gates, some holding photographs of Diana, while television crews discuss the cancelled meeting live. William is praised by some for drawing a line around his mother's memory. Others question whether family pain should carry so much influence over historical material. Catherine watches the reaction carefully because she understands how quickly public emotion can harden into sides. What had begun as a private dispute is now being treated as a test of loyalty. Camilla feels the full weight of that shift. She watches coverage that frames her solicitor's presence as a challenge to Diana's legacy, even though she never entered the archive meeting herself. The Queen Consort understands the brutal simplicity of the story now being told. William protected his mother, and she stood on the other side of the line. That framing hurts, because it leaves almost no room for nuance. She knows silence may look guilty, yet any defense risks making the story larger. Charles finally acts. The king authorizes a short palace clarification, stating that future Diana archive reviews will follow the new independent protocol, meaning the process will operate under rules separating historical review from personal legal interests. He does not criticize Camilla, and he does not dramatize William's decision, but the meaning is unmistakable. The prince's central demand has been accepted. That announcement effectively ends the struggle over procedure. What remains is the emotional verdict. The headlines turned a private fracture into a national symbol, but the monarchy's final response would reveal whether the moment had produced another wound or a lasting boundary. In the end, the cancelled meeting does not destroy the family. It forces the family to define a boundary it had avoided defining for years. William does not gain control over every memory of Diana. Camilla is not erased from royal life. Charles does not choose one side of his family and abandon the other. Instead, the crisis produces something simpler and more consequential: an agreement that grief, reputation, marriage, and historical truth cannot all be managed through the same legal door. William accepts the new archive process because it gives Diana's material room to be understood before anyone starts measuring its effect on living reputations. Historical stewardship simply means protecting and interpreting important records for the future, while keeping personal legal interests separate from that work. For the prince, that distinction matters because his mother's letters are not weapons, and they are not bargaining tools. They are part of a life that ended long ago, but whose meaning still reaches deeply into his own. William enters the rescheduled session with none of the fury that defined the first cancellation. He checks the attendance sheet carefully, pauses, and then takes his seat. No personal solicitor appears on the list. This time, the meeting goes ahead. The future king feels relief rather than victory. He knows nothing about this decision can restore what he lost, but the boundary now exists, and that is enough. His mother's archive will be reviewed without anyone sitting in the room solely to defend a living royal from what Diana may have written. Camilla accepts the new reality quietly. The queen consort understands that protecting herself cannot come at the cost of appearing to influence Diana's legacy. She does not challenge the arrangement, because she also recognizes that another confrontation would deepen wounds that have already consumed too much of the family. Her acceptance is painful, but it is also final. Charles chooses reconciliation over triumph. The king supports William's safeguard while refusing to let the crisis become a permanent judgment against his wife. He understands that his son's cancellation was not revenge. It was the moment grief collided with institutional ambiguity and forced the monarchy to draw a cleaner line between memory and self-protection. Diana's legacy remains powerful because it belongs to both family memory and national history. Nobody truly wins. William gains reassurance. Camilla accepts a painful boundary. Charles prevents the disagreement from becoming a lasting rupture. The monarchy emerges with one clear principle: the dead should not need lawyers to defend their place in history. There is no next battle to tease, because this one ends with a line finally drawn. And, for once, everyone understands why it must remain there. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.